Okay, so what if I told you that the man who interrogated America's top fighter pilots for Nazi Germany was the exact same man who designed the absolutely beautiful mosaics inside Disney's Cinderella castle? It sounds completely made up, I know, but it's a true story.
So let's get into this. On one hand, you have Hanns Scharff. He was the Luftwaffe's so-called master interrogator during World War II, and he was famous for being incredibly successful at getting information from captured Allied pilots. But it's also the story of that same guy becoming a world-renowned artist. His stunning work is in some of America's most iconic landmarks. You've almost certainly seen it, but you probably had no idea about the incredible story behind the artist himself.
So, how is that even possible? How can one person be such a massive contradiction? An interrogator for the Third Reich and a celebrated Disney artist? Well, that's the mystery we're going to unravel right now.
So, let's start with the interrogator in the castle. Now, this story doesn't begin with some committed, hardened soldier. No, it starts with a series of unbelievable accidents and a life that was never, ever meant for the military.
You see, Scharf never wanted to be a soldier. Not at all. In fact, his life before the war was heading in a completely different and honestly a much more ordinary direction.
He wasn't some kind of military fanatic. He was a successful businessman, a director in an overseas textile company, and he'd been living in South Africa for 10 years. Now, his father was a distinguished war hero, but Scharf was building his own life in sales. But then, in 1939, he just happened to be visiting family in Germany when war broke out. And just like that, he was stopped. His entire path was just shaped by sheer chance. It's really incredible. In 1942, he gets drafted and is scheduled to be sent to the Russian front, which back then was basically a death sentence. But his wife, Margaret, who was actually British, amazingly talks her way into a general's office and gets him reassigned. So he's transferred to be an interpreter. And then, in 1943, the guys who were doing the interrogating, they die in a plane crash. And suddenly, Hanns Scharff is the new interrogation officer. And here's the most important part. He had zero formal training. None. Everything he became famous for, all these revolutionary techniques, he just learned by watching and using his own gut feelings. He pretty much made it all up as he went along. So this brings us to the Scharff technique. What he came up with would literally change interrogation forever. He didn't use brutality. Instead, he came up with this psychological method that was so effective, it's now known by his name, the Scharff technique. At its very core, it was a totally radical idea for the time. He decided he would befriend his prisoners. His entire method was built on creating rapport and empathy. He never, ever used physical abuse, and he never used threats. You could say his weapon was kindness. And he developed this really clever four-step process. First, he'd use a prisoner's natural fear of the Gestapo to his advantage. Then, step 2, he'd position himself as the prisoner's ally, the one guy who could protect them from the Gestapo. Third, he'd build a real friendship through conversation and kind gestures. And finally, the masterstroke. He would use information he already had to convince the prisoner that he knew everything, making them feel like any little detail they shared wasn't a big deal. I mean, the contrast with how things were usually done is just night and day. Where others used threats and fear, he used rapport and friendship. Where they used physical force, he used psychological insight. He wasn't beating forced confessions out of people, he was getting them to volunteer information, and often they didn't even realize they were doing it. And the way he built these friendships, the tactics are just unbelievable. He'd share his wife's baked goods. He would take prisoners for walks in the woods. After they gave their word of honor, they wouldn't try to escape. He arranged for them to have tea with famous German fighter aces. Get this, he even let one captured American pilot test fly a German Bf-109 fighter plane. Can you even imagine that happening today? So take the story of Francis Gabby Gabreski, America's top fighter ace in Europe. Scharff had Gabreski's picture on his office wall for months, telling people he was expecting him. When Gabreski was finally shot down and captured, Scharff greeted him like an old friend. And while Gabreski never actually gave up any useful intel, the two formed such a strong bond that they became lifelong friends after the war. And that leads us to his totally new life in mosaics. Okay, let's dive into the next chapter of his life, which is somehow just as unbelievable as the first one. The war ends, and Scharff's story takes another wild, unpredictable turn.
So in this truly ironic twist, his former enemies, the United States Air Force, they invite him to America in 1948. And why? To lecture them on his interrogation techniques. They were so impressed by how humane and effective he was that they gave him immigration status, and he decided to stick around. So what does a former Luftwaffe interrogator do in post-war America? Well, he falls back on the art training he had as a young man. He starts a company, Hanns Scharff Designs, and completely reinvents himself, becoming this celebrated, world-renowned mosaic artist. And his work is everywhere. It's truly iconic. He and his studio created those 5 famous 15-foot-tall mosaics that tell the story of Cinderella inside the castle at Walt Disney World. He also designed the marble mosaic floor in the California State Capitol, the entry ramps at Epcot, and mosaics for LA City Hall. Millions and millions of people have seen and admired his art. So, finally, let's talk about the interrogator's lasting legacy. How do we connect these two lives, the Nazi interrogator and the Disney artist? Well, the answer lies in his lasting and deeply ironic influence. His methods, the ones born in a Luftwaffe interrogation center, were so effective and so humane that they were officially incorporated into the curriculum for U.S. military and FBI interrogation schools after the war ended. And this wasn't just some casual thing. It was official policy. As one report put it, quote, "The FBI and others have now adopted the technique. The very intelligence agencies created to fight regimes like Nazi Germany ended up learning from one of its most unusual officers." And this isn't just ancient history. His influence is still felt today. The U.S. High-Value Interrogation Group, which was formed in 2009 to handle the most critical intelligence gathering, still studies and validates the effectiveness of the Scharff technique for modern counterterrorism. Which leaves us with a final, really powerful question, one that echoes from Hanns Scharff's unbelievable life all the way into our modern world. Can the most effective interrogation also be the most humane?